Okay, hello again. I'm going to continue with my reading of trout fishing in Chilean rivers, this time starting at chapter 6, and I expect I will include chapter 7 in this particular video. All right, here we go. Chapter 6, a few reflections on local problems. Some of my friends may feel that this chapter might well have been left out of the book, as it may be liable to create in the minds of anglers abroad an unfavorable and totally erroneous impression of the fishing conditions in this country. Possibly I am making a mountain out of a molehill, but I feel that no description of fishing conditions in Chile would be honest without a reference to the abuses which are prevalent, and I shall endeavor to present a few constructive suggestions as to how they may be overcome. Let me make it clear at the outset that I am well aware of the difficulties encountered by the Department of Fisheries in combating abuses, which occur mostly in outlying districts, miles from anywhere, and it must be remembered that they are entirely dependent on the action of the police authorities. They are to be congratulated on the progress they have made in recent years in their attempts to improve fishing conditions, and they deserve the full support and cooperation of every fisherman in the country. The following story will give you an idea of what they are up against. A group of fishermen camped out several years ago on the shores of a lake in the south at a point close to the outlet of a river coming from the Cordillera. By the way, Cordillera means mountain range in Spanish, and here it refers to the Andes. I might have said that in earlier videos, actually, because it appeared there also. They were far from any village, road, or railway, quite out in the wilds. One night they heard a weird noise in the distance, which sounded like organized shouting and screaming. The noise was growing louder and obviously coming closer, so they went out to investigate. The explanation was a group of Indians. There are comparatively few Indians left in this country, coming down the river on rafts with flaming torches, beating the water with branches, and making at the same time an infernal row. At the mouth of the river, a rough palisade had been constructed in a V shape with a gap in the middle, and on the other side of the gap there was a net. I need hardly explain that the purpose of this expedition was to frighten and drive the fish down the river and net them at the palisade, and I believe they got a considerable haul. In case this should be deemed a fairy tale, the fishermen took photographs of the palisade next day as evidence. It is rarely that fishermen go as far into the wilds as on this occasion, and this sort of thing might be going on in the upper reaches of many rivers without the authorities knowing anything about it. And it is still more liable to happen in the winter during the spawning season, when food may be scarce. It is to be presumed that the fish were being trapped for food purposes, as it is hard to see how they could be marketed in such a remote spot. You will appreciate that, even if the fishing authorities and the police are advised of such happenings, it is difficult to suggest a means of stopping them, outside of permanent vigilance on every river, which is quite impracticable. It must be remembered that this country is large and sparsely populated. The area is some 300,000 square miles, and the population is said to be in the neighborhood of 5.5 million, of whom 30% reside in Santiago and Valparaiso. In the country districts, leaving out of account all towns, the average population cannot exceed 10 per square mile. Another story has to be told of a development of recent years. One day I was fishing upstream in the river Colanco in the central zone near Santiago, and from the point where I entered the stream for several hundred yards, I was surprised to find no trace whatsoever of any trout. I decided to leave the water and walk along the bank further upstream. Shortly afterwards, I was astonished to discover the reason for the lack of fish. 4 men in bathing costumes, each carrying a sack, were catching trout by hand, the procedure being for 2 of them to stand at the top of a pool, while the other 2 drove the trout up under the rocks and stones, whereupon they picked them out by hand. And by the time I reached them, 2 of the sacks were more than half full. I need hardly say that the whole affair took my breath away and depressed me, as I was powerless to interfere. I continued upstream a few hundred yards and had some good sport, although with the feeling that if this sort of thing continued, I might as well give up any idea of fishing this delightful stream again, and in fact, I have never returned. Unfortunately, I hear that the same practice is going on in the river Molina near Farellones, where some workmen have become expert at this method of catching fish. An interesting feature is that they state that they only catch brown trout, the rainbow being much too clever for them, whereas the brown trout go to the bottom and are easy victims, a further corroboration of their distinctive habits. Dynamiting still goes on, although on a reduced scale, and illegal netting continues to be practiced by professional fishermen. It ought to be a simple matter to put a stop to dynamiting, as, according to the law, dynamite can only be bought with a permit. Another common offence is fishing without a license. In fact, the fishermen who do take out licenses are in the vast minority and are actually the sportsmen who observe the rules of the game. The biggest problem of all, however, is the fishing, or perhaps I should call it poaching, in the close season. And professional fishermen throughout the country carry on this practice every winter with a complete disregard for or in ignorance of the harm they may be doing. And now, having painted this unhappy picture, it behoves us to consider ways and means of improving matters. The experience of Pucón is an object lesson to the whole country. After the new hotel was opened, the fishing in the river Trancura deteriorated year by year to such a point that the management became seriously worried over the lack of trout, which was keeping fishermen away and causing Pucón to lose its well-earned reputation as the best fishing in Chile. Experienced fishermen were consulted and gave as their opinion of the cause of the deterioration that the failure to enforce the law regarding the buying and selling of trout during the closed season encouraged netting and dynamiting by professional fishermen, precisely during the period when the fish were spawning. The winter in the south of Chile is a long, dreary period with abundance, indeed superabundance, of rain, and the professional fishermen used to eke out a livelihood by netting fish and spawning fish at that and selling them. They had apparently no difficulty in finding a market for the trout, and it is even said that large quantities of smoked trout were being exported to Germany from the south of Chile. When it was explained to the hotel management that the extraction of spawning fish in the closed season was doing more harm than anything else, it was decided to approach the authorities for assistance in combating the closed season poaching in the river Trancura. I believe that for 2 winters, professional fishermen were forbidden the river, and anyone found offering trout for sale was immediately taken to the police station, put into custody, and then asked to explain their origin. The result of this vigilance speaks for itself. The fishing in Pucón greatly improved in the seasons following and quite recovered its lost prestige. Let us hope that the experience in Pucón will be an encouragement to government authorities to prohibit close-season fishing all over the country. This is easier said than done, of course, but I have no doubt it will be achieved in time. Several years ago, there was a small hotel in Pucón where smoked trout were generally on sale. When the authorities commenced to take action there, they fined the owner of the hotel for receiving fish during the spawning season for smoking purposes, as it is against the law to buy and sell fish during that period. He was very upset about it, and as a result gave up the smoking business. This goes to show that the enforcement of the law by the authorities will have a salutary effect. On the other hand, it is regrettable to report that fresh trout are to be found on the menu of Santiago hotels and restaurants throughout the spawning season. It is very discouraging and disquieting for those interested in the development of fishing in this country when hotels and restaurants, which should do everything possible to encourage tourists, continue a practice so detrimental to a sport of great attraction to visitors. It has been pointed out to me, and rightly, that I should draw a distinction between poaching in the closed season for commercial purposes and for food purposes. However grievous an offence close season poaching may be, one cannot blame the settler in very out-of-the-way places for harpooning fat spawning trout for his own food. A friend tells me that at the far end of Lake Caburga, northeast of Pucón, he met an old fellow who had lived there in the back of beyond for 27 years. He was most hospitable, and in the course of conversation revealed that 2 of his sons were artistes at spearing trout in winter, and that hardly a day passed when they didn't get a 20-pounder. He explained that they only took what they needed for food and could scarcely get anything else. There is nothing more to be said in such circumstances. It has frequently been suggested that the granting of fishing rights by the government would help to solve the problem, as the lessees of the water would take their own steps to protect the fishing for which they were paying. The renting of fishing to those who are in a position to pay for it and the consequent exclusion of the poorer citizen would not, I am sure, appeal to the government of this democratic country and can safely be discounted as a possibility. To my way of thinking, it is one of the splendid features of fishing in Chile that anyone may fish whatever his station in life, and I should be very sorry to see any limitation of such privileges. The solution of the problem of the protection of the rivers lies with the police authorities chiefly, and if they will enforce the law regarding fishing and/or the buying and selling of fish during the spawning season, the trouble is as good as over. Another matter which should be actively taken up is that of licenses. As the law stands at present, one has to have a license to fish, but the law is not enforced, and it is rarely that any fisherman is asked to produce his license. It would be more satisfactory to issue free licenses to fishermen in poor financial circumstances and to ensure that the law is properly observed. The cancellation or suspension of licenses for contravention of the law might have a salutary effect on the professional fishermen who are at present the main cause of the trouble. Free licenses would, of course, only be issued to fishermen with a satisfactory record. At present, the Director of Fisheries, in accordance with the law, has named a number of ad honorem, that's unpaid, fishing inspectors throughout the country whose duty is to report infringements of the law. Many of them do their job quite conscientiously, but their work is of no value whatsoever if the authorities do not take action. The idea of naming ad honorem fishing inspectors is a good one, but the root of the matter lies in the cooperation of the authorities, and by that I mean the police officials in the fishing districts. In such remote places, control is undoubtedly difficult, but it can be exercised, especially if the offenders have to come down to the railway stations or the more populous districts to dispose of their illegal catches. If they find it difficult to sell the trout, they will stop catching more than they require for household purposes. If any of my readers in other countries are inclined to look askance at the condition of things I have so frankly exposed, I would ask them to remember that trout fishing in this country is in its infancy, and that the fishing history of other countries discloses that they have had the same problems to contend with in the past in a greater or lesser degree. Human nature is, after all, the same the world over. There is nothing to be alarmed about in the existing state of affairs, with the exception of the fishing by hand. And anglers intending to visit Chile need have no fears that the fishing is suffering seriously. Leaving out of account seasonal disturbances of a temporary nature, the general opinion is that it is as good as ever it was. Indeed, while I strongly disapprove of the abuses I have cited, I believe that up to a point they are actually having a good effect on the fishing, a statement which sounds so paradoxical that it calls for an immediate explanation. The point is that there are experienced fishermen in Chile who hold the opinion that the greatest enemy of the fish is the fish themselves, that they multiply too quickly in relation to the food and space at their disposal, and that closed season fishing and netting in moderation are actually beneficial in keeping down the numbers. On the other hand, there are others who claim that the best fish are taken in the nets, the mesh of which is of a size to let the small ones escape. And in the closed season, when they come up to spawn, and they give that as the reason why the fish in certain rivers seem to be smaller than they used to be. I incline to the opinion that the reduced size of the fish in any river is an indication that there is a surfeit of fish and that steps should be taken to reduce the numbers, but emphatically such steps should be systematic netting by the Department of Fisheries and not illegal methods. I am aware that a certain amount of authorized netting has in the past been carried out in rivers which the Department of Fisheries has considered too full of fish, but would respectfully submit that this problem of living space is a serious one and will have to be tackled in a bigger way to achieve any real result. The same problem has occurred already in New Zealand and has been handled successfully by the authorities, I understand, by means of wholesale netting and the provision of more food in waters where deterioration has been evident. Fortunately, no serious problem has arisen as yet in the south of Chile, and it is only in certain rivers in the central zone that the need for immediate action is great. In any event, the angler from abroad may rest assured that the fishing in Chile will come up to his expectations, and I trust he will realize that my criticisms are not destructive, but made with the definite purpose of anticipating possible deterioration and counteracting it, so that the high standard of trout fishing in this country may be preserved. And when he reads in later chapters of the glorious fishing to be had at, for example, Pucón and Pangui Pulli, he will decide that we have no real fishing problems in this country as yet. Finally, may I propose that there be set up in Santiago, under the wing of the Department of Fisheries, a salmon and trout fishing advisory board composed of leading fishermen of experience who would be willing to give their services in an honorary capacity for research work and the preservation and development of fishing in Chile. I'm sure that there are a number of keen and progressive fishermen with experience in this and other countries who would be altruistic enough to devote their spare time in the interests of their favorite sport. And if they could have at their disposal the services of a fishing expert, as suggested in the previous chapter, good results could be expected in a reasonably short time. But such a board would be of little avail without the cooperation of the governing authorities, and in the exercise of vigilance and the development of the fishing resources of the country, they would have to be prepared to spend money. All right, let's move on to chapter 7, Tackle, Equipment, and Boatman. The main purpose of this chapter is to advise the angler from abroad what he requires to bring along with him in the shape of tackle and equipment. My own equipment has been acquired over a period of years from British makers, mainly Hardy, by which he means the firm of Hardy Brothers at Alnwick, Northumberland, which was founded in 1872 and is still in business. And for identification purposes, I have mentioned Hardy tackle, with which I am most familiar. This, I trust, will be a sufficient guide to American and Canadian anglers to enable them to select the tackle they require from the makers they favor. The visitor generally concentrates on the south, and few have the opportunity of trying the rivers in the central zone. While my main remarks will deal with requirements for the south, I feel that a few words about Santiago and district would not be amiss. For the small mountain streams where the fish average about 3/4 of a pound, I use very often a 7.5-foot split cane rod weighing 3¼ ounces with a reel and line balanced to the rod. Some of my friends prefer a slightly heavier rod of, say, 9.5 feet and 5 ounces, such as a Fairchild, as they argue that the very small and light rod is not so good for casting. While I am prepared to admit the soundness of this argument, I feel that on the average, the advantages of the small rod outweigh the disadvantages. Most of the mountain streams are somewhat difficult to fish on account of overhanging trees and branches. And the utility of the small rod under such conditions is obvious. The other advantage is that the small 3/4 pound fish can be appreciated better by fishing as light as possible. Nevertheless, towards the end of the season, when the water is clear as crystal and the trout are becoming very wary, there is every advantage in being able to cast as far as possible. And on such occasions, I always bring out my 9-foot light rod. A fine trout line of, say, 25 yards with the same amount of backing would be adequate under any conditions in this zone. For the cast, I should recommend 1/x to 3/x strength. Is that 1 times to 3 times strength? As regards flies, my experience is that on a favorable day, and most days are favorable, the trout appear to be ravenous, and will take almost anything. On such days, 2 at one time are taken frequently, and on one occasion I even saw 3 at the same time. The ordinary lake trout flies will do, the size ranging from 0 to 5 Hardy hooks, to be determined by the clarity of the water. In my own experience, a teal wing has never failed me, and my particular favorite is a Peter Ross. Peter Ross was a storekeeper in Chilean, Perthshire, and I've got a picture of a Peter Ross fly. there in the footnote. Peter Ross, 1873 to 1923. However, I know that every angler has his own favorite flies for every type of fishing and will use his own judgment in accordance with the conditions he has to cope with. The following can be highly recommended: Peter Ross, Greenwell's Glory, Hardy's Favorite, March Brown, Coachman, Wickham's Fancy, Black Zulu, Watson's Fancy, Butcher, Colonel Downman, and Beaver Hill. In recent years, considerable success has been obtained by the use of parachute flies, the theory being that their deadliness is due to the way they land upon the water. Later on in the season, when there is not too much water, an expert dry fly fisherman can have excellent sport in the pools. I do not consider myself fitted to advise the expert dry fly fisherman regarding the flies he should have available. I should say a comprehensive selection of standard patterns, as the Chilean trout are not very particular, which must include a white moth for the evening. The following is a possible selection of dry flies: red spinner, dark Cahill, quill Gordon, silver sedge, black gnat, alder, Greenwell's Glory, olive dun, California coachman, ginger quill, web fir, Bajent's brown. There is a fly uncommonly like the grannum, which is also called a caddisfly, to be seen on Chilean waters. The reason why few fishermen use a net in the smaller mountain streams is probably laziness and the desire to travel light. For the same reason, it is rarely that waders are seen in those streams, the majority preferring to get wet rather than carry the extra weight. This is understandable, as one has to walk longish distances in hot weather, and on the way home, the creel, that's the basket to hold your catch, is generally well filled and inclined to be heavy. Nowadays, the angler is very often accompanied by a secretario, a small native boy from one of the shacks in the vicinity, who is quite happy to come along and make himself useful as ghillie for the fun of it. By the way, before we go over to the next page, I've got a grannum. There's a grannum. Okay. For my own part, I always take a secretario if one is available, as his general utility is considerable, and I like company when I am fishing. If he should start off by being over-talkative and a bit of a nuisance, he will soon learn what is expected of him and keep his distance. At the end of the day, a gift of a fly and an old piece of gut will be appreciated by the secretario. For the rivers in the south, say from the river Lachad southwards, the tackle required is very different. The rod I favor for casting purposes is something on the lines of the J.J. Hardy No. 2, which is a wet fly rod, 9 feet 9 inches long and weighing 7.5 ounces. Of course, if you run into a 19-pounder with this rod, you will wish you had something a little heavier, but with patience, you will land the fish. For ordinary purposes, I think it is quite heavy enough, and I generally take the risk of the big one. Nevertheless, there are occasions when one is glad of a more powerful rod, as for instance, towards the end of the season, when the fish are running bigger, and I would recommend the visitor to include in his equipment something heavier, but not exceeding, say, 11 feet in length and 10 ounces in weight. On a windy day, also, when casting is difficult, it is much more useful than the lighter rod. In most rivers in the south, the bank fishing is limited, and there are long stretches where trolling a fly or a spoon or other lure is inevitable. For this purpose, a spinning rod is advisable, such as Hardy's Hollingworth rod. In this country, orthodox spinning is rarely indulged in, presumably because submerged rocks and tree trunks are so frequent in many rivers. It may, however, be nothing more or less than lack of experience on the part of the fishermen, although it must be admitted that in recent years it has become more prevalent. In the south, in most rivers, it is a good plan to carry 2 rods, one for fly fishing and one for trolling, unless, of course, you prefer spinning, in which case one good spinning rod will be adequate. The reel and line will naturally be balanced to your particular rod. I should recommend, as a minimum, 40 yards of double tapered line and 60 yards of backing as essential. In my own experience, with 100 yards in all, I was taken out to the bitter end by a big fish and would have felt more comfortable with 20 yards more. Gut strength, in my opinion, should vary between 9/5 and 5/5. which is as strong as necessary under any circumstances. My preference is for 9 feet casts tapered from 5/5 to 9/5, but some of my friends fish finer than 9/5 even. Maybe it's 9/5 and 5/5 rather than 9/5 and 5/5. Anyway, the size of the salmon fly required will depend on circumstances, and in my experience, it is useful to carry a selection between 1/0 and 3, with perhaps a few larger ones to tempt the big one, on the odd occasion when you may decide to try for him in selected water. However, the very big hooks are too heavy for the light trout for casting purposes, and are only useful when trolling, but the same effect can be obtained by the use of streamer flies, to which I shall refer later. It has always been said that the silver-bodied salmon fly does best in the south of Chile, which is probably explained by its resemblance in the water to a small fish. In my experience, the recognized salmon flies are all successful, and each angler has his own particular favorite. I would suggest that one should be armed with the following selection: silver gray, silver doctor, black doctor, blue doctor, Jock Scott, Wilkinson, Lady Caroline, Thunder and Lightning, Dunkeld, Dusty Miller, Green Highlander, Durham Ranger, Red Torish, Yellow Torish. In recent years, fishermen in the south have had considerable success with the streamer salmon fly, which differs from the ordinary salmon fly in that the wing is twice or even 3 times as long and is generally tied to order. The action in the water resembles a small fish and is said to be irresistible to the trout, but possibly its success may lie in the fact that it is something different from the everyday salmon fly, or, in other words, a new attraction for the unsuspecting trout. Whatever the explanation is, some anglers in this country now swear by the streamer fly, and there is no doubt that for casting purposes, it is especially useful, as the length of the wing conveys all the effect of the big fly and attracts big fish. For the information of those fishermen who are not familiar with the streamer fly, I show on page blank, unfortunately there are no photographs, I show on page blank a photograph of 4 streamer flies tied in Chile by Agustin R. Edwards, which are exact as to size and color. He finds that with those 4 patterns, he can tackle any situation which may arise. Then there are 2 salmon flies, which are tied locally and are especially interesting. One is the Norton, tied by the late Bertram Norton, which has the reputation of being a killer, and the other is Dr. James McLean's Apancora, or crab fly, of which there are excellent reports. It resembles a crab in the water and has the reputation of being almost infallible. If you have the good fortune to have one in your fishing bag, try it after everything else has failed, and you may be surprised at the result. A photograph of this interesting fly is shown also on page blank. Alas, no photographs. I haven't found them. They may turn up later, but who knows? While on the subject of salmon flies, I am reminded of a fly not included in the list, which has an interesting history. On a wet day in Pucon, some 22 years ago, Mr. Clarence Elliott of Stevenage, England, amused himself by making up a fly from the wrappings of a box of chocolates, mainly silver paper secured by cotton thread, and red and green strands of wool from a cushion or antimacassar. And he presented the completed article to a lady in the hotel, who proceeded next day to catch the record fish of the season, a 12-pounder with the fly. I think this Clarence Elliott may be Clarence Elliott, 1881 to 1969, garden writer and alpine plant specialist who visited Chile in 1927 to 8 and 1929 to 30. He had a nursery at Stevenage named 6 Hills, opened in 1906. It may be him, but there is an extra T, Clarence Elliott with 2 T's, whereas in the original text there's only 1. So perhaps not. Further experiments continued to be successful, and Mr. Elliott told me later that as far as he knew, nothing under a 5-pounder had ever been caught on his fly. When he returned to London, he had the fly patented by Messrs. Ogden Smith under the name of Elliott's Ragbag. I have tried the fly on several occasions, and it has lived up to its reputation, with the unfortunate addendum that I have never caught a fish at all on it. I have remarked earlier that Chile is a fly fisherman's paradise, but it would be ridiculous to suggest that conditions are always favorable for fly fishing, as every fisherman knows. The river may be a little dirty after heavy rain, the water may be too deep, or it may just be a day when the fish will not look at a fly, however tastefully presented. The wise fisherman will be equipped, therefore, with a selection of artificial lures, spoons, minnows, flatfish, orenos, etc., of varying shapes and sizes to meet varying circumstances, or, as the purist describes them, an assortment of ironmongery. I never think of ironmongery without recalling a delightful story told me several years ago by a fisherman friend. Towards dusk one evening, he was casting from the bank near a mouth of a river when a boat drifted down to within a few yards of him. Notes were compared of the day's fishing, and the boat fisherman complained that he had had what he described as a lousy day, having lost all his artificial lures except one on submerged tree trunks, stones, etc., and got only 2 fish. However, he had kept the pièce de résistance until the end, and he was sure he would get results with it. He announced, holding up triumphantly an amazing contraption called a wobbler, which was a sort of super minnow with a joint in the middle to make the tail move or shimmy and convey a touch of realism to the unfortunate and unsuspecting trout. He then proceeded to lower his treasure into the water. But no sooner had he done so than a most unseemly storm of invective rent the air and shook the peaceful waters, language such as had never been heard before on the river. He had forgotten to tie the cast to the line. Another amusing story takes us to the dining car of the express from the south, where several fishermen from various fishing resorts have foregathered on the way back to Santiago after a long weekend, Thursday to Wednesday, and are recounting their experiences. That is a long weekend. That's a week, isn't it? One sportsman announced that his best catch was a 4.5 pounder on the tail and a 3 pounder on the dropper. A dropper is a subsidiary line or loop of filament attached to a main line or leader. So there is a dropper line at one and the same time, and he proceeded to give an account of the engagement and its successful conclusion. A keen young fisherman, a student of the art and anxious to learn, who had joined the party, was deeply impressed with his feat and could not refrain from asking, "What flies were you using?" The answer took his breath away. "Flies? Not a chance. I had a spoon on the tail and a minnow on the dropper." To get back to equipment, as the rivers are generally swift and the footing insecure, for wading purposes, I strongly recommend a combined landing net and wading staff on the lines of the Don in Hardy's catalogue. I also recommend the use of thigh waders or fishing stockings, as I think that waist waders or fishing trousers are dangerous in a strong current. Whatever one may say, there is always the temptation to go a little further and a little deeper to reach some likely water. And the deeper you go in heavy water, the more likely you are to lose control. I freely admit, however, that one misses a lot of good water with only thigh waders. In the south, where a boat is required, the importance of the boatman can hardly be overemphasized. A good boatman who knows the river and can handle his boat skillfully will enable the fisherman to take advantages of stretches of beautiful water where bank fishing is possible. It is often a question of skillful maneuvering, and the inexperienced boatman will allow the current to carry the boat beyond the spot or over the very water which should be fished. My advice to the visitor is to concentrate on getting a good boatman and to treat him well, that is to say, with consideration. It has always seemed to me that one would get the best out of the southern rivers if it were possible to anchor the boat and cast all around it from it, as in loch fishing. The difficulty has always been that the ordinary anchor is useless as it gets caught under the rocks and stones and becomes immovable, and it is suggested that a rope net with a rock inside would solve the problem. Anyway, it is well worth trying, and I commend the idea to my fishing friends in this country for what it may be worth. Another suggestion which appeals to me is that an iron weight, similar to that used with the canoe in the swift-flowing Canadian rivers, might be successful. The difficulty is that the flat-bottomed boat used in Chile is much heavier than a canoe, and the iron weight required to hold the boat against the current might be too heavy and unwieldy for practical purposes. Some years ago, I understand that an old town canoe was used successfully in the river Trankura at Bukon, and that it was possible to anchor it almost anywhere by means of a rope net. The ordinary oars proved too light, and heavier ones had to be made of native wood. The main point is that the canoe could be anchored to give access to water otherwise inaccessible to fishermen wading or trolling. An arrangement whereby boats could be anchored easily would undoubtedly revolutionize fishing in the south of Chile. I have in fact seen an iron weight used during the past season with considerable effect. While on the subject of the boat, the visitor would be well advised to include in his, excuse me while I turn the page, equipment, a rubber cushion, as the wooden seats are very hard. Some years ago, I had a cushion made of rubber composition in the shape of a duckboard, and it was a great comfort, not only in the boat, but also when riding a horse on an uncomfortable saddle. And if you go to Lifen, you will probably have to ride a horse. A rod rest is a good thing to have while you are trolling, as otherwise you have to hold onto the rod all the time, and it is usually just when you are lighting your pipe in a wind and have your rod between your knees that a fish gets on. In any case, you probably want to fix up a cast while you are trolling, and it is annoying to have to hang on to your rod all the time. In my remarks on climatic conditions, I advise you to come prepared for rain. Some American fishing friends in Chile have finally arrived at what they claim to be the best protection against heavy rain. It consists of a long waterproof cape with sleeves and a hole for the head with a zip fastener to close up the neck tightly. It is long enough almost to touch the ground when one is sitting. Combined with a broad-rimmed waterproof hat, it is claimed that this cape, which is really an adaptation of the Chilean poncho, a woolen blanket with a hole for the head, will keep you dry under the worst conditions. If you are an exponent of the solunar theory, you will, of course, bring along your tables. Opinions among local fishermen as to their utility in Chile are divided, but there are more in favor than against it. It is understandable that local fishermen who claim to know the best fishing times under varying weather conditions on their favorite waters should be stubborn about being guided by tables instead of their own knowledge of nature and the habits of the fish. For example, Laja fishermen will tell you that the best fishing on that river is between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. invariably, and it generally seems to work out. If that be so, the solunar tables would not apply there. It must also be borne in mind that local conditions peculiar to Chile, such as volcanic disturbances and puelches, winds from the Andes, a dry fern-like wind. Puelche is a dry fern-like wind which occurs in south-central Chile, named after the Puelche people. They can cause fast snow melt in the Andes and produce floods. We've already met Puelche in a previous chapter, but anyway, that's a footnote which I added. So these puelches, winds from the Andes, would upset any tables, but they should not be abandoned without an adequate test. I keep an open mind on the subject, and I believe that time and experience will prove the tables to be useful. Now I feel that my visitor is more or less equipped with essentials, and I'm assuming that he will look after accessories such as the fishing bag with its 101 contents and the inevitable fisherman's flask. He must arrive in Chile with everything he is likely to require, as while certain fishing requisites are obtainable in limited quantities, he should not count on being able to replace things easily. And that is the end of chapter 7, so I will stop here. Thank you for listening.